Well, good afternoon, everyone. Everybody heard the tornado sirens, I hope, so they know it's time for Art for Lunch. Thanks for coming out today. We do this on the first Wednesday of every month, and I see some new faces, so welcome, welcome. I'm Seth Hopkins, the director, and I'd like to welcome you to the museum. And we're going to talk a little about some guy named Remington today. I'm assuming you've heard of him. So we're going to be all Remington all the time for a little while here at the museum, particularly this weekend with our opening. How many of you are members of the museum? Thank you, thank you, thank you. What's wrong with the rest of y'all? The exhibition opens technically for members on Saturday and the public on Sunday, and we've got a lot of activities going on. How many of you have RSVP'd to be here for Saturday's activities? Okay. If you have not, talk to them at the front desk and they'll see what they can do. We're anticipating about 400 folks in this room for the opening lecture with Michael Shapiro. So be patient with us when you come Saturday, because it's going to be all hands on deck event and a lot of fun, and the kinds of issues we like to deal with having that many folks showing up. Other programming going on related to that, on September 20th, we are going to have a gentleman here, Michael Blake, who has just written a book on Teddy Roosevelt. And we may talk about it a little bit today. I'll try not to steal any of his thunder, but Roosevelt and Remington were pretty good friends. Remington did some work on a book that Roosevelt wrote, and Roosevelt received one of Remington's sculptures as a gift from his troops, the Rough Riders, and he thought that was one of the highest honors he had ever received in his career. But Michael Blake will be here on September 20th. That'll be our third Thursday lecture in September, and we'll talk about Roosevelt's life, his time in the West, and also his relationship with Remington. Saturday, September 22nd is Smithsonian Museum Day. So if you know any folks who aren't members and who don't want to pay admission to get in, which I can't imagine why anybody wouldn't want to do that, but they can go to the Smithsonian website and print out a coupon to get free admission that day. So it's one of the things that we do to reach out with our Smithsonian affiliates around the country and try to get folks to focus on museums on that day and be aware of the museums that are right there in their backyard. Our other exhibitions that are up right now, Wildlife Art of Guy Koliak, our Photography Guild exhibition, if you haven't seen that yet, just opened a couple of weeks ago downstairs, and is a wonderful exhibition from our members, and the photographs of Marty Stewart up in our Picturing America gallery. So I don't want to labor too much with other things going on, other than to give you a sneak preview of our symposium. That's our 4-day weekend festival and symposium, October, fourth weekend in October. And one of the core parts of that is our art history symposium. And we're going to have some of the greatest Remington experts in the world here to help us further understand Remington. After we've had the exhibit here a couple of months and lived with it, then these folks will be here to take our understanding to another level. Peter Hasrick, who is the guy who wrote the book on the Remington, will be doing actually 2 lectures that day. One will be a compare and contrast of Charlie Russell and Frederic Remington. We hear their names combined so often, it's almost like they're one person sometimes. And so he's going to kind of dissect Remington and Russell in a compare and contrast. Andrew Nelson, who's one of the top film scholars in the country, you may remember he was here for Art for Lunch last summer and did a show about John Wayne movies, and that it was a real myth that John Wayne movies ceased to be popular in the 70s and all these new age westerns, took over the genre. It's just not true, which nobody wants to hear, but he wrote a book about it anyway. But he's going to talk about how Remington's artwork was used by people like John Ford to envision their movies and to create lasting scenes. And so he's going to be looking at Remington artwork and then scenes from classic Western movies. Karen McWhorter, who's the curator at the Buffalo Bill Museum in Cody, Wyoming, one of the facilities that's been so nice to us to lend us some of this artwork for this exhibition. She will be here and talk about Remington's working methods, dissect his studio, how it was set up, what it looked like, and how he worked in it, and how the objects in the studio inspired his work. And then Peter will come back and clean up in the afternoon, and he's going to talk about fakes and forgeries in Remington's artwork. He's been on the Catalog Raisonné committee for, I think, 30 years plus, and you can't imagine how many fakes and forgeries of Remington's artwork he's seen through the years. And so he's going to talk about how that process works, how they determine what's legit, what's not, what goes in the book, and what doesn't. So that's going to be a really interesting program to finish up that day. So mark your calendar. That's October 25th, I believe, if that's the fourth Friday in October. Somebody will check me on that. 26th, thank you. Thank you. So the question has come up, why Remington? Well, why not, right? 6 years ago, I was in Alpine, Texas, and was visiting one of our members who lives there. And they had a Remington exhibition at the Sul Ross University Museum of the Big Bend, which I had never heard of, but we went over there and we checked it out. They had about 30 pieces of Remington's art, a nice small exhibition. And my member said to us, wouldn't this be nice to be at the booth? And I said, it would, but it would only fill about half of our gallery. So we would need to flesh it out with some other things. So we got in touch with the Remington Art Museum, which is in Ogdensburg, New York. So when I say New York, you think New York City, right? Ogdensburg is about as far as you can get from New York City, literally and figuratively. It's up on the St. Lawrence River. It's actually closer to Toronto than it is New York City. And when Remington grew up there, it was a very wild place. It was still the edge of the frontier. Much different than where Charlie Russell grew up. And again, I don't want to steal any of Peter's thunder, but Charlie Russell grew up in a very ritzy neighborhood in St. Louis, yet he's the cowboy artist and Remington city slicker. But we'll leave that for another day. But the museum in Ogdensburg says, yes, we'd love to loan you this exhibition that travels called Treasures from the Frederic Remington Art Museum. Has about 30 pieces. We said, can we work with other people and call it And Beyond? And they said, sure. So the And Beyond part became working with the Buffalo Bill Museum in Cody. They've loaned about 14 pieces. They also have loaned 4 artifacts from Remington's studio. These are things Remington owned, had in his studio, and probably painted more than once into a painting somewhere. And those are part of a mock-up of a studio that we've done, and I think you're going to enjoy that. The Amon Carter Museum in Fort Worth, Texas loaned a piece. The Birmingham Art Museum, Birmingham, Alabama, which has a wonderful Remington collection. Imagine that. And then we had private collectors in Texas, Florida, and right here in Atlanta. 6 of the pieces in the exhibition are from collections, people here in Atlanta, Georgia. Again, who knew, right? We did. So that's how the exhibition got pulled together. We also had a portfolio of prints that had been donated to the museum as part of a big collection out of Chicago that we got a couple of years ago. So we were able to bring something out of our archives and storage to be part of the exhibition as well. So altogether, 70 pieces. Of those, only 6 are sculptures. Everybody knows about Remington sculpture, right? So we're going to have some of those, and we're going to talk about them. But the real emphasis of the exhibition is Remington was a heck of a painter. In fact, he might have been the best painter or one of the best painters of his generation. And if he had lived past 48 years of age, we would probably know that much more than we do today. I'm sorry, Mr. Remington, I didn't mean to talk about your death. Forget I said anything. Because we're going to go on a time warp, okay? Is everybody ready? We're going to go back to September 5th, 1908. Okay? Mr. Peabody, set the Wayback Machine, please. 1908. It's now 1908. Hello, Mr. Remington.
Nice to meet you, Mr. Hopkins.
We are so pleased to have this exhibition work.
Well, I'm very excited myself. I have wanted very much to be part of a museum. I've struggled to get accepted by the people who are museum people, and they just seem to resist it, saying that my work, because I'm an illustrator and because so much of my life has been doing articles and stories and illustrations for the various magazines like Harper's Weekly and Harper's Monthly, they said that my paintings do not deserve to be in a museum. I totally disagree. I think my work is as good as anybody working out there at all today. And then the fact that I saw the last of the wild places, the last of the open country, the last of the wild Indian people, the last of the buffalo herds, that I went where the men with the bark on actually did their work and that are gone now forever. I'm the person who most represents those people, most represents the military that fought the Indians, and most represents those men who brought cattle up the Texas Trail.
Well, we'll take your word for it, but we're going to look at some of your art to reinforce that. We at this museum, of course, don't worry about these definitions of illustrator and artist and so on, which makes us a good match, because the academic people at those other museums don't value your work. You have, though, consciously tried to move your work towards them.
I really think that that's the future for art. The future for art is to get away from people and individuals and to capture the moment that is eternal. And that's why I've been doing things like landscapes with open country, with the beautiful lakes, the trees, the wonderful skies, the cloud formations. I think that's what's happening in the world of art. The people, the 10 and the people from overseas in Europe that are being called impressionists, they're understanding that the future for art is away from individuals and towards something that is lasting and eternal and captures a moment, not only of something happening, but something that happens in your mind, something that happens in your heart. And that's what I want my landscapes to do.
And a bit more universal as well, not a moment in time for one person, but a moment in time for anybody.
That everybody can relate to, yes. That captures where the human beings are.
Well, let's start at the beginning, though, and let's do a little bit of your history, shall we say. This is your life. This newfangled technology doesn't work in 1908.
Well, I was born right around the time that the Civil War started, and my father was a colonel in the Civil War in the Union Army, and he was a great soldier. He had many honors. He was awarded many battle honors. In fact, I admired him greatly. It's what really caused me to be interested in the military and to be a person who wanted to represent the military. And my first drawings I ever made as a child were of soldiers and horses.
Well, here's a map of New York State, and you can show us where you were born in that area of the country.
I was born in Canton, which is very close, and of course, I lived in Ogdenburg. I lived in Inglenook. I basically stayed up in that north country, which I loved because of the forests and the lakes and the open country. I loved to swim. I loved to hike. I loved to ride horses. I was an outdoorsman. I was a person who loved to be outdoors in the wilderness, and we had wilderness in northern New York at that time.
And then you went on to Yale.
Well, I spent a year at Yale. I studied the art there, and I was the only male in the art class, freshman art class at Yale.
That sounds great.
It did sound great, except for one problem. They didn't let me spend any time with the ladies, and they made us draw pictures of still life and draw pictures of reproduction plaster casts of Greek sculpture. And you think of anything more boring than to have to do a charcoal drawing of Venus de Milo without her arms. It was boring. And what I wanted to draw is I wanted to draw action. I wanted to draw stories. I wanted to draw people doing things.
And nude female models.
We won't talk.
So you're drawing sculpture.
drawing copies of sculpture. That was
Wow.
just, and they claimed that would help us get ready, but what we needed to do is draw the living, breathing, wonderful wilderness country, the West. And that's what I wanted to do, is draw the people that went west.
And this is a photograph of you as a young man. You're a pretty decent looking guy in your day.
Well, I think it's hung in there pretty well, actually.
And you were quite a horseman growing up as well.
I loved horses. I always loved horses. I always cared about horses. I've always felt that that was my best work, to draw the horse. And in fact, I've been asked what I wanted on my tombstone if and when I die in the far distant future from now.
Yes, far, far distant.
And actually, the only thing I really want besides my name is the statement, "He knew the horse," because that's what I cared about most in my art.
And this is your horse Beauty, I think,
Yep.
in that picture.
Yep.
And here's what you're talking about, is being able to translate knowing the horse into some of these wonderful drawings.
We always had horses on the property. We always had. We didn't even when cars came around, we still used a horse and a cart to get to town. I preferred horses. I still prefer horses.
And this is a good example of a horse study that you would have done. Um, how many hundreds of these did you think you did in the
I
last
think
30
we
years?
we went into the thousands of drawings of horses. I'd go out and watch them in pasture as they would eat. We'd watch them move, watch them running. I realized before anybody else did that there were times in which a horse, when he was at full gallop, actually had all 4 feet off the ground at the same time. And artists didn't realize that. Most of those early artists, some of them like Bierstadt and people like that, they had no idea how the legs of a horse move. And most of those paintings are very stiff, especially those European painters that had no idea what a running horse looked like.
Well, like Miller or somebody like that, they look like carousel
Yes,
horses,
they
do
look
they not?
exactly like carousel horses. They look stiff and awkward. And I wanted my horses to have the living, breathing feeling about them. I wanted the people to see the sweat on that horse. Many times I would have the horse come right out at the viewer, as if he was about to receive that horse into his lap. And that was my idea of what an exciting painting should look
I got you. So, Mr. Muybridge, who invented stop action photography to prove that point, he could have saved himself a lot of time if he'd have just come
just
and
looked
asked
at my
you.
work. That's all he needed to do. But it was helpful to prove that my ideas were correct when Edward Muybridge actually made those photographs and showed that I was right when I painted horses with their feet off the ground.
And speaking of that, here's one on the screen right now where all four legs are up. And what the heck is that guy doing with that gun?
Well, those are muzzle-loader single-shot rifles. If the Indians are charging and you've got to get away, but at the same time you've got to defend yourself, the only thing you can do is reload while you're on a full gallop. And so, since they're single-shot muzzle-loader rifles, you got to get that bullet into the barrel somehow at a full gallop. So he had the bullet in his mouth, and he's pushing it with his tongue into the barrel, and then he's going to have to push it down into actually with a rod, and that'll give him another shot. Otherwise, he is unloaded.
Now, did you see this done?
Well, we didn't see it exactly, but we talked about it. The the wild people that were still there when I traveled out west talked about what the men did at the time that they were being chased by Indians, well, how they behaved and what they did, and I embraced those stories and I brought them into my work, made them part of my art.
So this is a story that was told to you around the campfire on one of your Western
The
trips.
the people were showing there actually go back to about the 1840s, 1830s, 1840s. By 1850, probably they weren't doing that, and by the Civil War period, they were starting to use ammunition that was breech-loading ammunition. Didn't have to do what they're doing in that
I
painting.
see. Now, you and perhaps your friend Owen Wister may deserve the majority of the credit for turning the cowboy into a romantic hero versus maybe a ruffian, as he had been more characterized in an earlier generation. Would you say that's correct?
Owen Wister and I were friends, and we both were writing stories for Harper's Magazine. His stories were a little more flowery, had a little more flourish than mine. Mine tended to be just the bare bones of what it was like to be on horseback, to travel with the Western people, to travel with the military. But Owen was a good writer. I mean, obviously, when I wrote my first book, The Way of the Indian, and had it published, it certainly didn't do as well as The Virginian, which became a classic and was a great work. But we worked together on the story of the cowman, the story of the cowpuncher, and this was published together with my illustrations and with his idea that the origin of the man on horseback, because the man on horseback is a little higher than everybody else. I mean, everybody else is just a foot. But the man on horseback has its origins back in the days of the Knights of the Round Table, the men who traveled in the days of King Arthur and the conquistadors that came through the Spanish time, and so he started to tell a story about how the natural man on horseback in America, the cowboy, begins way back, travels right up to this, so that our American cowboys are the end product of the Knights of the Round Table and of the men of old and the men of Europe. Some of that's a little bit off because most of the cowboys came from the Spanish vaqueros, and they actually should have had more information about Mexico than he did about Europe. But it was a great article, a great series of articles, and my illustrations showed those men from the days of King Arthur all the way up to the man on horseback who came up the Texas trails and brought cattle to the railroad.
So the English version, the Knights of the Round Table, is a little more sexy and romantic than
It definitely caught the imagination of the reading public.
right. And to this day, that began, as I said, the romantic mythic idea of the cowboy, and made him into a hero because he had not really been that before, right?
The thing about the man on horseback, the thing about the cowboy, is that at a time in which the world was becoming so restrictive, the government was getting into everybody's life, and big cities were expanding, and traffic and business and the smog and the problems of living in the city. You looked at that man coming up the trail on horseback, and he could go in any direction. There was no restriction. He had no controls. He had no walls around him, and he could travel in any direction. That was a romantic sense of freedom. That was what Americans wanted. They wanted to be able to experience that freedom that had been allowed to them by the Constitution. And the man on horseback, the cowboy, the cowpuncher, represented that in America more than any other individual. He represented that open life, that unrestricted life, that life in which government allows him to have total freedom. We liked it, we enjoyed it, and we wanted to think that we ourselves could have lived that life. And I got to see it. I got to experience it. I was part of the last of the open country, the last of the open range, the last of the wild place.
But knowing you as I do, Mr. Remington, that might have been a little strenuous for you.
There were times. There were times when my weight made it difficult to ride, made it difficult to go on horseback. But those first trips, especially the trip that I took for Harper's Magazine when I went out to Arizona and traveled with the Buffalo Soldiers, with the 10th Cavalry, Lieutenant Powhatan Clark embraced my coming, and he enjoyed my being there. And we actually took off and traveled on an adventure to try to capture Geronimo. Oh, what an exciting time that was. And to ride with the Buffalo Soldiers, and I experienced what it was like for these men to work. And you can't believe how cheerful they were. They worked hard all day long in the saddle. They put in long hours under the hot, blazing sun of Arizona, and yet they never complained. They never grumbled. They always told stories and jokes around the campfire. They were very pleasant to work with, and they were willing to fight. They were men who were prepared to fight whenever the enemy showed up. It was an adventure well worth going on, and it was written up in Harper's Magazine, A Scout with the Buffalo Soldiers. It was among my earliest and my most pleasant experiences that turned into articles for the magazine.
Another of the types that would go out west, and you are credited with developing the types of the Westerner, I think, more than any other artist by far. the prospector, as we see in this picture, is also exercising that freedom that you were talking
That's
about.
right. And here was a chance not only to go out west, but a chance for wealth. Let's face it, if you went out to California in the days of the 49ers, you could come home with a great deal of wealth. You could find gold right there in the streams of California. And later, 10 years later, there was gold in Colorado, and you could go to Colorado in 59 and have the same adventures in the mountains of Colorado. So, to be able to paint and draw and write about the people who lived those adventures, I think it captured the imagination of the people that lived in cities, and they began to read those articles and they began to see that art, and they could both visualize in their mind and in their imagination what it was like to live free.
And to be clear, just again, you would not have witnessed the majority of these things. They were past, but there were people alive who had experienced them and were relating these
That's
to you.
exactly right. And it was great because when I traveled with the military, it was usually the top brass that was interested in these stories. General Nelson Miles took me under his wing. We went to Mexico together. We went out west together. And because he was a general, he opened the door for me to be able to be and see and be part of these things. And after all, if you're a general, you value articles and stories and magazines, because the next step after being a general is being a politician. And Nelson Miles definitely wanted to be president of the United States. He was very glad to have me write stories about his adventure.
Good press clippings don't hurt.
That's
Sure.
right.
This painting, just quickly, I think is one of the great examples that will be in the exhibition of a fairly detailed painting that crosses the line, perhaps. May have started as an illustration, but winds up as what I would call a piece of fine art because of the coloration, the light, and the amount of time I'm sure you're able to put in on it because of the wonderful deal you had cut with your publisher.
Yeah, these were we had agreement that I didn't have to make the deadlines of like so many writers do or artists have to do. So I did have a chance to do studio work, and of course sketches. I would make sketches on the trail when we were traveling. I'd make notes. I'd do sketches and drawings. I'd make comments in the sketches as to what colors I had seen, so that if I saw that shadows took on a certain purple color or a violet color, I'd make notes on that. And then when I got back to the studio and had the time to actually work on the paintings and paint the things, they had more time. So that painting and my favorite, of course, of that time period, that same kind of period, was uh, the Dash for the Timber, which was a really a very large painting that involved a great deal of effort and a great deal of time spent getting all the details right.
I think this audience is very familiar with that image since it's hanging in our bar here at the museum.
That's a good place.
Absolutely. You mentioned bringing those sketches and your remembrances and memories back to the studio. Here's a shot of your studio that we took last week, and it looks like a pretty happening place. A lot of stuff on hanging on the walls. What is it about this space and the things that are in it that inspire you or help you do your work?
Well, everything on the wall, from a stew pipe bag to an Apache basket, everything here represents a memory. It represents the fact that it's something that I purchased sometimes on the Ute reservation, sometimes on the Cheyenne reservation, and every time I came back with something that was made by the native peoples, it allows me to remember what it was like to be there, what it was like to experience it. And it really helps when I start to paint, when I start to draw. And even when I work with mud, when I work with the sculpture product that produces the bronze, all of those little items are things that stir my memory and stir my mind and allow me to remember what it was like to experience and feel what it was like to be on the to be on the hurricane deck of a bucking horse.
Well, and your critics and cynics, of which you have gathered more than a few over the years,
That's true.
say that the studio is just all put on for people who want to commission paintings or come by paintings to have a show place to show them in.
That's ridiculous. Every single thing in the studio represents an actual living experience that I had out west.
Fair enough. So you mentioned working with the mud, as you call it, and you got into sculpture, what, 15 years ago?
That's about right. And I hadn't really thought about it. And my friend Thomas said, you see things three-dimensionally, that you see things in the round. You should try doing that. And I needed a little help because I'd never built an armature before. I'd never actually seen how it worked. But my goal was to create a horse that was on just his hind legs, rearing up, trying to get rid of his rider. And so that idea was to have this bronco raising up. And this is a good example of how from the photographs, because we used photographs at that time a lot.
No, don't say you used photographs.
Well, we did. I'm sorry, but we had to have something to give us the memory of what was going on as well as the drawing. And this particular drawing shows exactly how a horse can be up on his hind legs and reach out, kicking and bucking, and that became the form that later became the Bronco Buster. It was my first bronze, it was my first sculpture, and by far still the most popular, still the one that most people want.
I've always wondered, is that a little disconcerting or depressing that the first one you ever did may wind up being the best?
The biggest problem is that some of them involve so much more work, and some of the sculptures that are so complicated, like the good example would be the one of Coming Through the Rye, in which there's so many different figures, and there's so many cowboys, and they're shooting their guns in the air as they ride into town celebrating, and it was by far more work and by far more difficult, and yet as a result of the fact that it was so difficult to cast, and because it was so costly, uh, we've sold very few of them. And so, fortunately, Bronco Buster continues to be one of the best forms of income for me, and I continue to sell copies of the Bronco Buster. And we do make them different because since it has to be done in the wax, we have a chance to make changes. We can change the position of the quirt. We can change some of them. Will have the legs in a different position. Some of them have the feet in the stirrup. Some of them have a slight different position on the tail. Uh, all of these things can be changed uh, before they actually go out and do the lost wax.
Now, Mr. Remington, I don't know if you know this, but your Bronco Buster has become so popular that people have been making casts off casts.
They're not supposed to do this.
Yes, I know, but it is being done.
Well, we're going to have to get legal involved in that because that's not appropriate.
Well, and I hate to burden you any more on that subject, but if you can look at the photographs here, one of these is one of the early ones you did with Henry Bonner Foundry by the sandcast method. One of these is Roman Bronze Works, which you did lost wax.
So does most of my work.
They do going forward, absolutely. And then one is somebody who has cast one from a cast.
That person needs to go to jail.
We agree. But can you see the difference?
Well, it's a little far away from me, but
Well,
I can see it up close. Yeah. Oh yeah. Now you can see. Look at the mustache. Look at the mustache on the fellow on the right, and look how badly the one on the left is. I mean, it literally is the detail on it. Even the folds of the cloth of his shirt are just not exactly not sure at all. And yet the hair is good on there. Look at how bad the hair is on the upper left.
so how does that make you feel?
Well, it's certainly inappropriate to make sad copies of what could have been a really beautiful work of art. Terrible.
Well, is it better that they have a bad copy or no copy?
It's better to have a no copy. They should just purchase the right copy because there are people who have those bronzes available and they can buy them. One of them, of course, is even at the White House because President Theodore Roosevelt was given a Bronco Buster, one of the early Bronco Busters. He was given it as a gift by his men, the Rough Riders that went with him to Cuba. And of course, I was there. I was in Cuba, and I actually saw the Rough Riders with Teddy Roosevelt going up San Juan Hill. And so I witnessed that, and it was such an exciting time for them that they decided they wanted to honor their leader, and they gave him a copy of the Bronco Buster one of the original copies of the Bronco Buster, not one of these fake ones like that. Teddy Roosevelt was so impressed that he said that this is the greatest honor that he had ever had. He says, from now on, everything else is just a fuss.
Well said. Not to belabor the point and injure you any further, but just a couple other pictures here of some of the detail in these casts that we hope you will look at very closely when the exhibition opens, so that you can understand Mr. Remington's frustration with these reproductions, and that you'll know that you want to run down to Tiffany's and buy the real thing.
That's right.
After you see them. Here you see the hat, and obviously significant difference as well. You mentioned some of the other bronzes have not been as popular, but some of them have been close to as popular. This is a good example.
Yeah, this one, I think the second from the Bronco Buster, probably the Rattlesnake was the one that actually was the best.
And this is the Outlaw.
The Outlaw didn't do quite as well. And of course, the Scalp. This is the Scalp. Not as many were made of the Scalp. That's a giant brave holding aloft the scalp that he took from an enemy. Maybe it's the fact that people maybe not want to have an image of a scalp is probably it's probably off some settlers with it.
Yeah, it's not coffee table or dining room
Right.
material necessarily, and the wives may have something to do with that.
That may well be true, because
And
Eva definitely would not want that in the house.
Maybe this would be a more appropriate subject.
Right, that's the Mountain Man, and that goes back to that painting that we did of the fella loading the flintlock with his mouth, because this fella is a period from about the 1840s. He's got his muzzle loader, he has his powder horn, he has all the accoutrements of a man going down the mountains in the 1840s, back in the days of the fur traffic.
And Mr. Remington, this is a good example of the Bronco Buster, but looks like you put on a few pounds in this picture
You know
as well.
what? I've been working on trying not to be so heavy, but yes, I'm pushing 300.
Well, I've enjoyed eating breakfast with you, and I dare say you
Yeah,
put away some groceries.
4 to 5, maybe 4 to 6 pork chops for breakfast is my personal preference. I like to include some fried potatoes and maybe about 3 cups of coffee. It makes a good breakfast.
Well, we will encourage you in your efforts to curtail some of that activity in hopes of a long life.
We hope so. Thank you, sir. We'll look forward to your exhibition.
Frederic Remington, everybody. So when Michael Shapiro is here for the opening on Saturday night, he's going to go through some of this material. We wanted to do it in a little different format, just change it up and make it a little different. Hope you've enjoyed it. And he will talk more specifically about some of these issues, about the numbers of each of these casts that were done and so on. I just want to give you a quick flavor for it. In Remington's lifetime, 1,014 sculptors were known to have come out of one of those two foundries. Now, how many went out the back door? We have no idea. How many were done after he died and his wife was still allowing them to be cast? We have no idea. How many were done after his wife passed away and his wife's sister allowed them to continue to be cast? We have no idea. And then how many are in the world, in existence? It's got to be hundreds of thousands. But I'm sorry, back up one second, Lindsay. The one really interesting number up there is the Bronco Buster, 375 out of roughly 1,000 pieces. Over a third of the bronzes he ever produced were Bronco. Go ahead. Go ahead to the next. As I asked Mr. Remington about painting, towards the end of his career, he started to get much looser, much impressionistic, and intentionally so. And I think when you see these last few slides, you'll see some of that. He mentioned his landscape being more universal, more eternal. These landscape studies are just really juicy. That's what my painter friends would call it. You can see in this buffalo hunt late in his career, The foreground and the background are very impressionistic. There's still a little bit of detail in the figures, but it's much more loosely painted than that cowboy painting we saw with the timber down that we were talking about, across the line from illustration to becoming fine art. As we look at these late pictures, and we'll actually have three major pictures that water and canoes and landscape figure into towards the end of the really drive that point home. In the obituary that Mr. McCracken, who was the director of the Buffalo Bill Museum, wrote his book on Remington, was the first major book on Remington. He said, such a tragedy that Remington had achieved the goal he had been striving for his adult career at the same time he passed. What he meant by that was that he finally had been accepted by the New York painters to a certain extent, that he was a fine artist worthy of being mentioned in the breath with them versus being just. And he dies at 48 years old from complications from appendicitis, a lot of it having to do with the fact that he was just so large they couldn't get where they needed to go and do things and dress just so on. But if he'd have lived another 10 or 20 years, who knows what his art might have looked like. It might have been Claude Monet-esque, following the American Impressionist tradition. So it's a real tragedy that we lost him so early. Yet in such a short career, he produced as much or more important Western art than lived. That's why it's important for us to have this exhibition here. Cowboy artists on down, they are following in the footsteps of Remington, Russell, and the others before them. But it is Remington and Russell's names that in the public's mind, and particularly Remington, who is Western. That's why it's important for us to have this exhibition. In addition to, we think it's going to be a blockbuster, attendance-wise, and so on. So we appreciate your support of the museum and allowing us to bring an exhibition to this scale and size and scope. Hope you'll encourage friends and family and everybody to. Any questions? Yes, sir. Mr. Remington's bronzes were sold primarily through Tiffany's on the retail side. They went from Roman bronze work down the street to Tiffany's and were on display in the store window there in Manhattan. Not that I know of. And what is a decent copy? That's another thing that Michael will cover a little bit. Sure, Peter will as well. Yes, sir. Anybody else? Yes, sir. We're getting some in, and then the other thing is Liz has pulled a whole section of books in the library, and what I would recommend is go down there and browse through those, and if there's one you like or you think is a good reference, we can order it for you, or of course there are lots of places to get. But we're bringing some in for sure. The best book on the sculpture is by Michael Greenbaum. In that, they show a lot of these detailed photographs like we were looking at, where they show legitimate lifetime casts versus later casts. You can really see the difference, close-up photograph. He was the first person to really do a comparative analysis on those in a book. That's the one I would most recommend on the bronze side. The big Remington biography book, the best overall.
And there's one that specifically deals with his nocturnal, the color of night.
That's correct.
And some of his nocturnal stuff just breathtaking. And you know how Frank Kenny Johnson has light coming from the fireplace that illuminates characters. Uh, he was doing stuff like that with his nocturnal stuff. So there's a book that specifically deals with that, and then there's one called The Masterwork that includes a lot of these uh, later pieces that have that wonderful color in them.
The nocturnal paintings was another way he was trying to get recognized as a fine artist. That, if you could do a good nocturne, you must be, a great artist and more than just an illustrator. And that book was the catalog for an exhibition called The Color of Night that originated at the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., traveled to a couple other venues. In my 20 years of being in the art world, it is the greatest single exhibition I've ever seen. It just blew me away. And incredible paintings in that show. So that's another book. Thanks for reminding me, Jim. Definitely recommend having if you're interested in his art. Anybody else? We'll be adjourned until Saturday.